All right, so without further ado, all the way live from California by way of Austria. I don't remember your last name. Klaus Neuhold.
Oh, there you go. Wow. All right, thank you so much for having us. Thanks, Boyd. Actually, I met him today at the API Summit. So there's this Austin API Summit going on this week. And we ran into each other there without even knowing. So that was nice. And I was able to share a ride with him on the way here. So anyways, my name is Klaus. I work for Blazemeter. So I'm from Austria originally. I worked there initially as a developer, then as a web consultant. I ran my own web consulting company. And then after a while, I started working as a product manager. And then I moved to California because my wife got a job there. And so now I work at Blazemeter. I don't have the guns for that. Yeah, so Blazemeter. Has any one of you heard of Blazemeter? Right. So has any one of you heard of JMeter? Okay, many more. Okay, so Blazemeter is a SaaS company, and the way that it started out was it was like JMeter in the cloud, right? You can see it from the name Blazemeter, JMeter, so there's some of that in there. Obviously, we're trying to grow and become more, so that's why we're also going into API functional testing, not just performance testing, not just load testing. So that's a little bit about Blazemeter. But today I want to focus more on sort of the open source based API functional and performance testing. And I'm going to talk about these three tools that you can see here: Jenkins, Taurus, and JMeter. I've already mentioned that. I assume everybody knows Jenkins, and I assume not a lot of you know Taurus, but we're going to fix that later. So first of all, outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to start with giving us a little bit of context about why API testing, what's the point of all of this, before we dive into the whole setup with Taurus, JMeter, and Jenkins, and then I'm going to do a quick demo. And at the end, we have some swag that we're going to give away, shirts. All right, so first of all, that's the context of the way that I like to put it. Sort of the goal of what we're trying to achieve is we want to develop quality APIs faster. And in order to be able to do that, one of the important things is we have to make sure that we make it easy to test them early. So ideally, we want to run tests with every build. And one way to achieve that is to have everything as code, which includes your tests. So, and one way to get, or on top of that, if you have everything as code, then it's easy to automate, right? If you can describe it, you can automate it. And so one of the ways that we're gonna achieve that today is by using YAML to describe and define your test scripts. And obviously we wanna also manage the whole thing in version control. Another way to look at all of this in terms of why API testing is to compare it to other kinds of testing. So I don't know, maybe you're familiar with Martin Fowler. So maybe you've seen this kind of pyramid on one of his blog posts. So the idea is you have UI testing at the top, then you have testing on the service layer, integration layer, in this case APIs, and you also have unit testing. And the further you get to the bottom of the pyramid, the more of this kind of testing you want to do. So the reason for that is As you can see on the side, unit testing is much faster than testing on the UI level, for example. Apart from that, it's also, testing on the UI level is also way more expensive because you have to spin up a browser and all that kind of stuff. Also, UI tests tend to be very brittle compared to API tests and also unit tests. Because the UI is the part of the system that tends to change the most. So API is supposed to be a more stable layer, obviously, right? You don't want to change your API all the time and break the contract. So this is the reason why in practice, oftentimes the pyramid tends to be inverted. There's a lot of UI testing going on, but ideally you should move away from that and only test in the UI, on the UI layer, whatever is really necessary there. So then you might ask yourself, well, then we can just unit test everything. But obviously, yes, then you're testing the individual units, but these units have to work together, and that's why you need to test on the integration layer. So that's where API testing comes in. Then in the title of the presentation, it said API functional testing and performance testing. So why do both of them together? Obviously, before we can do any kind of performance test or a load test, for example, we first have to make sure that it works. So first do the functional tests. Once it works, great, switch over. Now you can hit the system really hard. Also, why open source? Well, I assume I don't need to explain that to you, but it's a safe investment, not just for your business, but also for your career. And since we've talked about salaries, right? If you learn an open source technology, then that's something that tends to be more easy, like a skill that is more easy transferable to another company than if you learn some proprietary framework that only exists within this company. So today's demo, what I'm going to show is I will have my test script that lives on GitHub. So it's version controlled. And whenever I make a change, I will trigger a Jenkins build. And this Jenkins build will run Taurus. Taurus in return will run JMeter. So that's the execution engine of the test. And that will then result after the build has run either in a pass or fail. So I can pass or fail my build automatically based on my test results. We didn't practice that. So Taurus is an open source project. It's mainly developed by Blazemeter. And it's a framework that abstracts all of these open source test engines that you can see, the list here. So it's a layer of abstraction on top of these frameworks. So it's for all of the different performance testing engines like JMeter, like Gatling, Grinder, whatever floats your boat, as well as for Selenium, JUnit, so also for functional testing. Yeah, so I'll go into detail, but feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions, obviously. All right, so I'm gonna start with the easy things first. So how do you install it? On Mac, it's simple: brew install BCT. Anywhere else, you can use pip, for example. And then the way that you describe tests in Taurus. So as I mentioned earlier, if you can describe it, you can automate it. So that's why there's the YAML syntax to describe your tests. So this is a very simple load test. So what you can see here is the script that is split up into different sections. One of them is the execution section, and one of them is the scenario section. In the scenario section, you define what actually happens, right? So here it's very simple. It's just one URL. But in reality, you will have a complex scenario of a user navigating, for example, through your website or using your system using multiple API endpoints, and you will pass parameters from one API call to the next one, and you will have assertions and all that kind of stuff. So this is where you define the scenario of what happens. And then in the execution section, you define how do you run this scenario. So you're separating these two things from each other, which in turn allows you to, okay, I can run this scenario with different executors, like JMeter, for example, or any of the others that we mentioned. And also I can define whether I want to run this as a load test, what you can see here. I want to have 100 users. I want to have a ramp up time, hold for, I don't know how much you're familiar with the terminology of performance testing, these kinds of things. If you run a functional test, then you simply can set like the concurrency to 1, the iterations to 1, and you can run the whole scenario as a functional test. So that's why you want to separate this. Also, it's as you can see, it's a human readable format. So a lot of you said you were familiar with JMeter, so you know that there's the XML syntax, which is kind of clunky and hard to read. So this makes it easier to read, makes it also easier to version control. And also the other idea behind of this is that you can work with it right from your IDE, from your editor. So you can start testing early, what I mentioned before. So ideally you have your developers who will start testing while they develop, right? Will start writing tests while they develop the code. So we want to meet them where they live in their IDE. So that's that part. Of course, on top of that sits Blazemeter, which then runs the whole thing in the cloud. So you can do large-scale tests. You can have an APM integration to do like root cause analysis and all kinds of things. I don't want to go into detail about that. If you have questions, of course, you can talk to Kieran or myself afterwards. And then I'm going to jump into the demo. Unless you have any questions at this point. Yeah, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run a test. First, I'm gonna run it locally with Taurus. And then I'm gonna show how to plug the whole thing into Jenkins. Yeah. And otherwise, you can come. Yeah. So the SaaS part is just Blazemeter. So that's basically the commercial offering on top of the open source, right? What I'm going to show you in the demo, first I'm going to run a test locally with Taurus. And then I'm also going to run a test with Taurus on Jenkins. So you can run these tests locally from your machine with Taurus. You can run it with Jenkins without even using Blazemeter. So that's all the open source part, right? And then on top of that is Blazemeter.
Hi, I've actually seen you guys online for test benchmarking, I think, at one point in the past month when we were looking up Selenium and JMeter and a few other things. Something my team has had trouble with is automating the testing of user interfaces for Windows software. I know there's WinForms and a lot of C# stuff we can get really heavy into. And otherwise, there's very manual approach with something like Auto IT. Do you have any recommendations from industry?
So the focus of all of this, so you're familiar with JMeter as well. So you know that this is sort of like protocol level testing, right? So this is where it starts. Then you mentioned Selenium, which is UI testing, but not Windows apps, right? So this is where we come from, and this is sort of our focus. So Windows apps is, is not our main focus at this point. Let's put it this
I have a quick question too. So I'm trying to build a mental model along with you, and it seems like what you've said is that I can develop locally. So the testing, right? So I can cycle as the test developer really quickly locally using Taurus, and then I can deploy that into the cloud using Blazemeter, and that feels an awful lot like using Circle CI in terms of its workflow or Travis CI. The build is YAML type services. Do I have the right mental model?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Back here. I'm coming.
Yeah, I was just wondering, couldn't you do all that just with Jenkins?
Yeah, I'm gonna show it running as part of a Jenkins build. Yes. Yeah. That's the idea. Okay. Anyone else? All right. So let me switch over to the demo. So again, here I have my very simple test script that I'm going to run. And first, I'm going to run it locally. So I've already installed Taurus. So the brew install BCT is already done at this point. So the next thing is just simply running a Taurus test with BCT, which is the Taurus command, and the name of the YAML file. That's all it takes to start a test, basically. So while this, sorry? So behind the scenes, Taurus is, in this case, so in my execution section, I can also define an executor. The default executor is JMeter. So it's using JMeter in this case. I could say executor, whatever, something else, right? Gatling, Grinder. And it would use one of those. Default is JMeter. So what's happening is it's spinning up JMeter. My computer has been asleep, so it takes a little bit. And once it's running, we will actually be able to see the results live while the test is running in our terminal. Awkward silence. Here we go.
Questions?
Yeah.
Are the keys predefined, or are you doing any work on the back end to process that?
You mean the whatever is
Key value pairs.
Yeah, that's the Taurus YAML. So there's a Taurus has its own syntax, right, for defining test scripts, and this is what you can see here. So Taurus takes this, basically translates it to a JMeter script and runs it on JMeter in this case.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So now you can see, if you like retro 80s graphics, and this is for you. This is the load test running live. So this obviously will run for 5 minutes now. Yeah, you can see pass fail, you can see response times, you can see information about connection, all the details. This is obviously, so we can follow these results live during the test, but there's no history of these results. I mean, we have artifacts locally, but this is then where Blazemeter comes in, right? You would have like a history of your test results on top of it. But this is basically, you can do this locally. Anybody can install this locally on their machine, run tests. Yeah, we're hitting our demo site, which frequently gets the shit beaten off it. So this is running locally, and then as I said, the next step is, okay, now I want to plug this into my Jenkins build, right? I want to automate the whole thing, maybe with every build, with every change that I make. Right, so what I've done here is I have in my GitHub repository, I have my test script that lives here, and in my Jenkins I have this build set up that will run whenever anything changes in my repository, and that's basically it. And the idea is that not only a change of your application code will trigger a build, but also your tests live in your version control system, so they're also part of this cycle of this equation. So whenever I change something here, then it should also trigger my Jenkins build. So that's the idea. Any questions here?
Wait. Okay. And a lot of we have a lot of applications that use a single sign-on. How do you handle
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
the application? Normally, we have a lot of application use a single sign-on.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle that?
So, as I said, under the hood, we're using Jmeter to run this test. So whatever Jmeter can do, so everything you can do on the protocol level, so any kind of requests and responses that you can send as part of your, defining it as part of your login.
Do you have another setup in the Jmeter properties to set up all those single sign-on? And setup do you have for the Jmeter?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat it, please?
He wants to know how you use a single sign-on setup.
Yeah, whatever Jmeter can do. So, yes. Mm-hmm.
As I say, so you should set up a lot of stuff on the Jmeter level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So all you're doing with this test is just hitting the URL and just making a connection to it.
Yeah.
But you can with I don't know very much about JMeter, so that's maybe a little bit. But so you can hit it and you can run API test against it, like if you were calling the back end and putting in your variables and running the form. You can do all of the stuff like to work your way through.
Yeah.
Like a live user would use the site.
Exactly. You can extract values from a response, pass it on to the next request, like a real user scenario. This is not.
This is all programmatic. Okay.
I don't recommend doing your performance testing like this, hitting a single URL. That's not a realistic scenario. Right? This is just a demo.
Okay.
And so Taurus is basically the layer where you describe the test, right? And then it does the magic of converting it to any of the executors that actually perform the task.
So there's different ways. Yeah, you can, first of all, you can just describe your test right here, your test scenario in the scenario section, but you can also reuse your existing assets. So if you, for example, you already use JMeter, you have a ton of JMeter scripts. You don't want to start from scratch, right? So you can use Taurus to run your existing JMeter scripts as well.
So you just invoke that script instead of describing that script, right?
Yeah, you would just put the name of your JMeter script here instead of describing the scenario, or you can even do it from the command line BCT and run it with your JMX files.
And if you wanted to migrate that to this more descriptive form, do you have those tools as well?
Yeah, there's a converter, yeah.
As somebody who's less familiar with the testing of API level stuff, my perspective is that JMeter was pretty commonly seen for testing, JMeter was pretty common for testing API level stuff, and Selenium was pretty popular for testing browser stuff in about 2011. So is there? I saw a huge list of things that Taurus is compatible with. Is there something you say for somebody who is coming at API level testing now? Is there something that's a better fit than JMeter using the XML stuff that you're showing here?
The YAML stuff. You said XML. You meant?
Sorry, yeah, I meant the YAML.
Because JMeter tests are written in XML, or that's what JMeter spits out in this step. So what I can say is that JMeter is still like the biggest open source tool out there in terms of community, in terms of maturity, in terms of for performance testing. Yeah. Of course, yeah, performance testing. Biggest community. There's the JMeter plugins project. There's like, so you have the most like support for every kind of stuff that you want to test, right? Some of the other tools that are on the list are, for example, different, I don't know, certain programming languages, right? So there are sort of niche players in certain areas for certain specific use cases. But overall, it's still JMeter.
Thanks.
For performance testing again, yeah. And Selenium for GUI functional testing. Kieran has a question.
Yeah, no, I want to add to that. Like, the reason why people chose Taurus is might have users who want to test Selenium for the UI, and you can have JMeter through. So you want to standardize on the tool. So no matter what type of testing you're doing, you can still use Taurus, and it would be able to invoke all these tools from the one platform. So for most of the times, organizations want to have one tool which can do multiple things, and rather than trying to do a piecemeal. That's where Taurus plays that important. So that way, you can leverage whatever scripts you already have on Taurus and still be able to get the same value. And managing all of them with the GitHub, you can version control it, and you can have a tight control so that you don't drift. That's how Taurus.
So if I'm understanding, so a lot of enterprise customers always want, like they say, single pane of glass, which is usually full of crap, but this is kind of the idea of a single pane of quote unquote glass, so that at least from a top level, you have one sort of orchestration layer for your testing, and then whatever individual teams want to write their tests in, they can do whatever the heck they want as long as they integrate it into this, so that from a top level, you have kind of visibility. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah. And exactly that's, what we hear a lot from enterprise customers, that they want one tool to rule them all.
I think they spell pain that way, P-A-I-N though.
Ooh, money. Is there any existing tooling or plans from the open source side, perhaps, to integrate with configuration management tools during the testing process? Especially if we're talking about performance, whatnot, it'd be kind of cool to be able to run a recipe or a playbook or a module off the cuff, especially since those binaries are getting smaller and easier to run one-liners with. I think it would be a good introduction to the feature set, if I may speak boldly.
Okay. Yeah, not that I personally have heard of, but so as I mentioned, the Taurus open source project, mainly developed by a Blazemeter team. So I'm happy to bring that up, and maybe they have already heard and thought about this. Sounds like an interesting idea. Yeah. All right. Anyone else? Oh yeah. So what I'm doing here, this is not a plugin. I'm just using a, almost 1 second. So what's happening is just this. I hope I didn't destroy your dreams. No magic there. Plugin? So there is a performance plugin for Jenkins, which sort of does this, and there's a Blazemeter plugin for Jenkins, which also runs tests. So we have a couple of those, but we can talk. Mhm. Yeah, I hate to plug the product, but this is where Blazemeter comes in. So this is the part of the value on top of all of this, right? That you have a report history. I can, for example, for my API functional tests, I get this kind of reporting where I have a trend history. And for an individual test, I see all the requests, whether they passed or failed with all the details. So this is the visual part on top of this. And for performance tests, we have obviously different kinds of reporting because in a performance, especially load test, you're focused on statistical KPIs, right? You don't care about individual requests so much, but it's more about, more about seeing stuff like this. So this is part of.
Have to have target site that URL, and you like suggest to spin up.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? Yeah. All we need is URLs. Yeah.
Klaus, could you repeat the questions when, if I can't get there because it's hard to hear back here?
So the question was whether we also spin up infrastructure that is necessary to run like the system under test, right? But that's not part of this. Like, you have to do that.
So I get the idea of using Taurus for reuse of tests, but each of these execution engines has different capabilities, right? So Gatling's really good at load tests, and got Selenium. How do you take advantage of the things that make these all different while still using a standard kind of DSL like interface to? How does that work?
Yeah, so for example, Selenium, obviously, yes, there's different things that you will have there, right? You have your selectors or whatever. When you click a button, you have different commands in your YAML file, in your Taurus YAML file, something that you're just used to from Selenium, basically, these kinds of commands. So it's not exactly the same as when you describe a performance test, right? So there's going to be differences, yes, but it's the same idea and the same basic structure, but it varies in details. And for some of them, it's just simply running existing scripts, for example, right? Because also this list, like this, constantly expands, right? So new tools are added, and in the beginning, it's always just, okay, we're adding a new tool. You can run your existing scripts with it. It's not yet that you can describe everything in the YAML.
So this is kind of an open source project where if I find another executor I want to add, I can.
Yeah, let us know. And usually it's not a big deal to add another executor. So we're open to these kinds of requests, totally.
Do you all have any support for security-focused tests?
So this is actually something that I just looked at. Gauntlet is something started by an Austin community member quite a while back that abstracts security frameworks. And it looks like adding Gauntlet to the list of things that Taurus supports would be relatively straightforward.
Thanks. All right, anyone else? I think I had, let me see, there was something else. Yeah, there are some resources. I can share the slides if you're interested. So there's the Taurus website. There's
Klaus, if you'll email me those slides, we'll attach them to this meetup.
Sure.
Hold on, Bailey.
I'm just curious, if the project is called Taurus, why do you invoke it with the command BZT?
The B is for Blazemeter. And now, who wants to guess what Taurus stands for?
Bull.
Well, yeah. No, I think you can't really guess it. I only, getting there, yeah. Test automation running smoothly. I didn't come up with that.
Nice.
Oh yeah, swag. So we have t-shirts. I thought I can just give them away like this, or you want to come and talk to me, tell me a little bit about what you're doing in terms of API testing, because obviously I'm interested in hearing your stories. Or you can just come here, take the shirt, run away.
Let's do this. First of all, beer ops, Black Star. How many of y'all are interested in going to beer ops at Black Star? What do we do at beer ops? We drive over to Black Star, we order a beer or a soda in my case, order some food, and we talk about things like Blazemeter or other, or pay or what have you, right? Daria, are you gonna go? That's, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you're the only recruiter left. That's a no. So, how many people are interested in getting over, continuing the conversation at beer ops tonight? It's absolutely cool if your wife comes. It's cool, yeah. Plus ones are entirely welcome. They just might find the conversation uber nerdy, unless she is also uber nerdish. Fair enough. So, it typically takes us 20 or so minutes. So there were actually like 12 people who raised their hands. So if you go to, if you're the first person from the group to Black Star, would you please look for a spot where we could sit about, I know this is crazy, 16 people, because somebody always changes their mind as they're leaving going, oh, but I wanted to ask that guy this question. You know, so yeah, so if you're heading over there, please look for a space for about 16 folks, if you're the first one. For those of you who want to get swag from Klaus, come on up, have a conversation, and then when Eric waves at me, I'll use the magic voice to herd y'all out of here. So with that, thank you very much for making the effort, Klaus.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.